This is Think Smart with TMFG, your weekly podcast of what's newsworthy and relevant to everyday Canadians, with your host, Senior Financial Advisor Rob McClelland and Mike Connon of Assante Capital Management. Today on Think Smart with TMFG, Mike and I are going to be discussing trip, medical, and cancellation insurance. Mike, it's interesting. Insurance has a really bad name, and it's because we use insurance for different things. We would never think not to have car insurance. Not everyone has life insurance. I have a lot of clients who don't have life insurance. They assume they're going to make it till 80 before they pass away, and yet in our office we see 30, 40, 50-year-olds passing away all the time. Some of them have insurance, some of them don't. The one that often people forget about is travel insurance. And especially as you get older, because you're no longer going to be covered and you need to get your own private insurance. And I'll give an example of just something that struck me recently. We have car insurance. And between myself and my wife, within the last 12 months, we've had to replace 3 windows in our car.
And I saw those aren't cheap.
They're not cheap. Because of the technology today in cars, because you've got all this technology to sense how far a car's away from you, etc. Each car window was anywhere between $2,500 and $3,500.
Yeah.
Luckily, we had a deductible of $1,000. So even though we've had to replace 3 windows, it's only cost us $3,000.
Yep.
And yet the total cost is well over $10,000.
Yep.
So you ask me if I'm going to continue to renew my car insurance? Absolutely.
Yep. We've even had a situation we talked about trips. We were doing a trip. You got some money back through one of our trip cancellation insurance policies, didn't we?
We had a team trip to Portugal. It was an awards trip. It was a short 3-day trip to a cheap resort in Portugal. The team really wanted to go overseas and they preferred that, so we did it. But what happened is our flight got delayed, and we had cancellation insurance, and we were able to use it and get back at least half of the cost because we missed a full day of our 3-day trip.
Yep.
So let's talk about, some of the stories that have happened in terms of medical experience. Both you and I have had some personal ones. Talk about your dad.
So I always bring this up with people. I went to see my dad I remember it because it was September 2001. September 12th, I had to go over. So I was the first flight out after the September 11th. My dad fell sick in Ireland and he went into a coma. And when I went over there to go check it out, his insurance wasn't working. And as you could imagine, there's riders and insurance policies. And if you had anything to drink, alcohol rider, you weren't insured. And he's an Irishman going to Ireland, so I can certainly guarantee he had a drink before he went in. So the insurance company, whether fair or not, cancels insurance on that and wouldn't pay anything. The insurance bill, the possible bill was running at that time $10,000 a day. And if you could imagine how this was building up, the costs were extreme. At a certain point, I went over there. We had to fly him back. We paid about $120,000 in a medical evacuation to get him back home. And I remember taking my credit card, my brother's credit card, my sister's credit card, putting them all together to try to book this flight to fly him from Ireland to Greenland to Newfoundland to, I think it was Gravenhurst, and flew into from there to get him to the hospital. And he got better, but he wasn't too happy about the bill we gave him at the end of it. So
I had a very similar story. My father also had an accident in Ireland with a bathtub and whacked his head, and my sister had to go over there and deal with it. Anyways, we were able to get him back. But a more critical situation happened, actually. They had a place down in Florida at Marco Island, and one day he was out swimming, and sure enough, he went under. And there happened to be some people around the pool, saw him. They were able to get him out. Needless to say, he was in critical condition, and he had to be, once they stabilized him, the cost of treating him in the U.S. was so extreme, they decided it was cheaper to fly him back, but he had to have a private nurse on the flight.
It's 100 grand.
It was
Close to it.
extremely expensive. Luckily, they had insurance
Yep.
and they were covered. So there's two personal situations. We've also talked about a client a number of years ago where both of them were involved in a car accident. Again, it was, life and death for both of them. Both survived.
Yeah.
But without that insurance,
The care in the U.S. is wonderful, but it is extraordinarily expensive. So, and when you're in that type of care, you don't really have a choice. Remember, they're just doing care on you. They're not, at this time, these people were both unconscious. They're trying to save their lives, and they'll do whatever they can to save your lives, but guaranteed you're going to get a bill at the end of it.
we were just flying back from this trip we had, and my wife got into a conversation with this woman beside her who had her arm in a sling. And so she told us the story. 10 days earlier, they were supposed to be flying back, and the plane was delayed. They were in the plane, and they had to change planes. Everyone was rushing. Long story short, she ended up getting hit by a piece of luggage, falling down, breaking her arm, and she was unable to fly. They said that she had to lie still. I actually think she was there for something like 21 days and had to be treated in the Dominican Republic. Luckily, they had insurance that covered the cost of that. And, she was on her return flight with us. So once again, you don't know what to expect. And as you get older, you're not as stable. There's a higher chance that you may fall down. And if you do, you're probably going to break something because your bones just aren't as strong as they are when you're 20, 30, 40 years old.
Yeah. So let's start with the first stage of insurance, trip cancellation. So what's trip cancellation do?
Well, really what it does is you pay a little extra, and sometimes it feels like it's a lot extra. But if you're having to cancel the trip because of a medical reason, something that's happened before you've left, maybe you've got COVID, anything that can get in the way, maybe you've fallen and broken your own arm and you're not able to travel, maybe you've done something to your leg and you don't want to travel because you were going on a hiking trip and now you can't hike, so there's no point going on the trip. Trip cancellation insurance means you're going to get some of that money, not all of it, but a good portion of that money back.
Now, just a warning to people, I just booked a flight yesterday. Now, that airline is going to give me, I have to agree to not take trip cancellation 45 times, right? And when you look at the cost of the trip cancellation, when you're booking a flight or through one of the websites to book a flight, it's extraordinarily expensive and extraordinarily poor for what you get. So there's different ways to buy trip cancellation insurance. You can buy it, through a financial institution. We offer trip cancellation insurance, and it works very well. And you're much better off buying a policy. I usually recommend if people do a bit of traveling, you buy a policy that takes care of you for the whole entire year. And that way, you don't have to worry about any trips over the year. You're always covered for any trip you take. You say the max amount of days you're going to be on a trip. You have to stick within that maximum, but you can take as many trips as you want that year and be covered. And that way, you don't have to worry about those high fees you're going to get from the airlines or Expedia or whoever is supplying that type of insurance to you.
Some people use credit cards. I know I'm covered fairly well with my American Express card for trips, and I've taken advantage of it before. I've got my money. You just have to, let them know when you're in hospital and they deal with the rest of it. But there's a risk sometimes you go to book a trip and you're not using your American Express card, or someone else is paying for the flight for you and you're reimbursing them, and therefore you didn't put it through your American Express card. If you've got one of those other policies and you're over the age of 65, it's worthwhile. Then you're covered.
Yep.
And you're protected. They're all a little different. I'm not going to use any of the names. I did a bit of research a number of years ago for a client, looked at 3 different companies. They're all pretty similar. There's some tweaks to each of them, but no one policy is the gold standard from what I've seen.
I think all providers, the big differences between doing one when you have to pay when you get buying a flight and getting one individually. The ones individually are much more robust and much cheaper.
Medical travel insurance. So we've talked about cancellation insurance, medical travel insurance. That's really sort of back to some of the examples we talked about with your father, my father, the client who we just met coming back, or not client, the individual we met coming back from a flight. if you have proper medical, you want to make sure you're covered. It's no different. You're not going to take your car out of your driveway if you haven't got car insurance. Your body's the same thing. You shouldn't take your body to some faraway country that may not have very good medical services.
And the other thing too, it's an unknown expense. Like, I don't mind if people don't buy trip cancellation insurance, because you're doing a trip at $6,000. Worst case scenario, you lose $6,000.
Yeah.
But you can financially deal with that. When you get into medical insurance, you don't know how much that could cost you. You know, it could be $6,000, it could be $60,000, it could be $600,000. And that can happen in the US if you're traveling in those areas. So you don't know the cost. So that's one that's the most important thing to make sure is covered.
You also have to be careful. You know, some of the things to look out for with the travel medical insurance: at certain ages, credit cards, you're no longer covered. Number two, if you've had pre-existing conditions, some of those conditions won't apply. So you have to be a little careful in terms of if you're traveling.
So this is where you have to read your credit card, because people think they're covered. They may not be covered for those pre-existing conditions, and they may be over that age. And again, this is the time where when you're booking a trip, you got to make sure to go and, you know, the cost of some of this insurance on those booking agencies that's a big profit center for some agencies, is the travel insurance too. So some have good ones, some agencies I've seen. But a lot of times you can take a look at doing that insurance yourself too.
The other thing is, some people are actually uninsurable. Now, there are places you can get really expensive insurance, so you actually have some coverage. I remember my mother had to do that when she was in her 80s. And I found someone out in the West Coast who had offered a really good service, it was called high risk insurance. And there was someone who was willing to provide the protection needed. But again, you need to seek out those people or have someone like myself or Mike who can do that for you. So what have we learned? You know, we talk about trip cancellation, medical coverage. How can you sort of help to circumvent that a little bit, Mike?
Well, one thing we said is retirees should travel when they're younger, because insurance does become an issue for everyone at some stage. If you're lucky to live long enough, insurance is going to be an issue. So if you have these nice big trips planned, do them when you're insurable.
Make a list of places you want to go. I just finished watching on the plane, The Bucket List. It was a movie, came out a number of years ago with Jack Nicholson and Morgan Freeman, and both of them end up in a hospital with dying of cancer. And one of them has a lot of money, the other doesn't have money. Anyways, they become friends in hospital, and they make a list of all the things that they wanted to do, and they head off, and it's a very funny movie. But create your own bucket list. What are the things? What are the places? And it doesn't have to be places. You may want to go to, I know I have a wish to go to the Kentucky Derby at some point. I would like to go to the Masters at some point. I would like to go see a Final Four weekend of basketball games. So it doesn't have to be that I want to go to Costa Rica or to, Ireland or to Iceland. Make that list and start putting those big rocks and getting them done while you've got your health and energy.
I want to see the Leafs win the Stanley Cup.
Well, that you can't buy insurance for that one, so I don't know. I have a feeling it may not happen in our lifetimes the way we're going. We talked about this. We can't stress it enough. Remember, both individuals in a couple in a relationship need to be healthy to get that proper insurance. So the sooner you do it, the better chance that you don't run into some roadblocks there. The last thing is to note, always just check the exemptions, understand it. If you want someone to look at it for you, have someone else look at it just to sort of go through and say, yeah, here's what you're not covered for. These are the things you should be worried about.
Yeah. Don't go skydiving in Iraq. You may not be covered.
Well, they actually went skydiving in the Bucket List movies. So you can see these two 80-year-olds with cancer out skydiving. So
they weren't thinking about their insurance.
No, they were not. That brings us to the end of another week. Thank you for joining us. This is Rob and Mike with Think Smart from the McClelland Financial Group of Assante Capital Management, reminding you to subscribe so that you can have your best retirement ever.
You You've been listening to the McClelland Financial Group of Assante Capital Management Limited. Assante Capital Management Limited is a member of the Canadian Investor Protection Fund and the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada. Insurance products and services are provided through Assante Estate and Insurance Services Incorporated. This material is provided for general information and is subject to change without notice. Every effort has been made to compile this material from reliable sources. However, no warranty can be made as to its accuracy or completeness. Before acting on any of the previous information, please make sure to see a professional advisor for individual financial advice based on your personal circumstances. The opinions expressed are those of the authors and not necessarily those of Assante Capital Management Limited.